Thank you, everybody, for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Kim, and I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming events by visiting our website, pals.com. And if you don't already do so, please consider following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Tonight, we are so excited to welcome Roxane Gay, Larissa Pham, Kim Fu, and Lidia Yuknavitch. The four of them join us tonight to talk about the new book, Kink, a groundbreaking anthology of literary short fiction exploring love and desire, BDSM, and interests across the sexual spectrum. It's edited by R.O. Kwon and Garth Greenwell and features a roster of all-star contributors, including Roxane, Larissa, and Kim. Roxane Gay's writing appears in Best American Mystery Stories 2014, Best American Short Stories 2012, Best Sex Writing 2012, A Public Space, McSweeney's, Tin House, and many others. She is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. She's the author of the books Ayiti, An Untamed State, the New York Times bestselling Bad Feminist, the nationally bestselling Difficult Women, and the New York Times bestselling Hunger. She's also the author of World of Wakanda for Marvel, and she has several forthcoming books and is also at work on television and film projects. Larissa Pham is an artist and writer in Brooklyn. Her essays and criticism have appeared in the Paris Review Daily, Book Forum, Guernica, The Nation, and elsewhere. She's the author of Fantasian, a new lover's novella from Badlands Unlimited, and Pop Song, forthcoming from Catapult in May of this year. Kim Fu is the author of 2 novels and a collection of poetry. Her first story collection, Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century, will be published in 2022 by Tin House Books. Her novel For Today I Am a Boy won the Edmund White Award for Debut Fiction and was a finalist for the Penn Hemingway Award, as well as a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. Her second novel, The Lost Girls of Camp Forevermore, was a finalist for the Washington State Book Award and the OLA Evergreen Award. Fu's writing has appeared in Granta, The Atlantic, The New York Times, Hazlitt, and TLS. She lives in Seattle. Joining these 3 contributors in conversation this evening is Lidia Yuknavitch. Lidia is the author of the best-selling novels The Book of Joan, The Smallbacks of Children, and Dora, A Head Case, in addition to the anti-memoir The Chronology of Water and The Misfits Manifesto. Her TED Talk, The Beauty of Being a Misfit, has been viewed over 3.5 million times. She is the recipient of 2 Oregon Book Awards. She lives, works, and writes in Portland, Oregon, where she founded Corporeal Writing, a non-academic alternative for misfit writers and artists. Her short fiction collection, Verge, was released in paperback a few weeks ago, and her new novel, Thrust, is forthcoming as well from Riverhead. This evening's event will include an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. Most importantly, please consider supporting these authors and pals by purchasing a copy of Kink. Roxane, Larissa, Kim, and Lidia, it's such a pleasure to welcome this author dream team to Powell's, and thank you for joining us tonight.
The pleasure is ours.
Thank you.
Well, we thought, or I sort of demanded, that we could hear from these amazing authors. So, like a little delicious bite or snippet. And I'm positive you all agree with me. And so Kim has volunteered to read first. And will you be reading from the piece that's in Kink?
I will. And thank you. Yeah, we can hold it up as a double prop.
So beautiful.
Thank you so much, other Kim, for that really kind introduction, and thank you, Lidia, for hosting with us tonight. I'll be reading from my story in the collection Scissors. As the curtains open, Dee sits on an empty stage in a small cabaret-style theater. Black painted walls, the smell of dust burning on the stage lights, ancient cigarette smoke baked into blue velvet drapery. The spotlight swings to Dee, a garish full moon. She sits in a plain wooden chair, her wrists bound to the armrests and her ankles to the chair legs with neatly torn strips of canvas. Her posture is slumped and casual, her knees open and her shoulders expansive and angled slightly backward, as though lounging in a hot tub. Her white t-shirt dress rides up over her thighs, the radiant heat on her bare arms and legs. The audience sits crowded around tightly packed circular tables. Lit candles at the center of each one illuminate white tablecloths and sweating highball glasses, while the faces beyond remain largely in shadow. Elle enters, stage left, dressed in a fitted tuxedo with tails, the black bow tie locking in place her high neck shirt collar. She crosses in front of Dee. She holds up a pair of scissors, ordinary but large, stainless steel from tip to handle, as one might keep in the kitchen to snip through tendons and butcher twine. The steel catches the spotlight like a wink. I'll leave it there.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Kim. Roxane, we have collectively decided to offer delicious little tidbits first. So that's what's happening. Also,
Wonderful. Sorry I'm late. I had another event right before this.
no problem. Larissa has volunteered to read second for us. So I think you are reading too from, I'm going to hold this up every time. Kink, the beautiful Kink book.
I've tailored the section that I'm going to read specifically for this Portland bookstore audience. I'm a native Portlander myself, so they're staying in a cabin a few miles outside of Bristol, Vermont. It sits on the property of a couple who rent it out to vacationers. When they pull up into the gravel driveway, they see two horses, a big, beautiful mare and a squat little pony, flicking their tails in a meadow next to the property. And then there's some more stuff about them showing up. Anyway, they're in the cabin now. When she pees, as she does immediately upon their arrival, the sound of it is audible in the tiny cabin. You should turn on the water when you pee, he tells her as she steps out of the bathroom to wash her hands. It's more considerate. But it's the same sound of water either way, she says, confused. No, one is piss and one is water, he says. I can turn on the faucet if you want, she says, but she doesn't really mean it. She's an environmentalist. They have sex before they even begin to think about dinner. The light is warm and falls into everything in golden plains. In bed, she puts her hands above her head and waits for him to do what she wants him to do. She doesn't understand why he won't just take her, why he doesn't seem to understand what to do with her wrists. It seems to her that there's only one thing to do when someone puts her hands over her head. He is sweating above her, his skin flushed. The blood blossoms in a dark, rosy V from the center of his chest, up into his neck, coloring his narrow face. She can imagine it flowing through his body, moving toward his cock and away from his brain. Do what you want with me, she says. He doesn't say anything. She presses her wrists into the bed to give him an idea of what she wants, though nothing he could ever do would ever be enough. What she wants is for him to understand her, to anticipate her every need. She wants to submit to him so thoroughly that he possesses even her desires, recognizing her so thoroughly that she never has to ask for a thing. Please, she says.
Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful segment. And Roxane, would you agree to deliver us a small, delicious, tasty bite?
I said, yes, I'll be right back. I have to get my book.
Okay, we'll kill time.
Okay.
We'll wait for Roxane to deliver her tasty bite. But one thing I wanted to tell all of you that I was talking to Larissa and Kim about is the range of stories in this book, which, by the way, you should go out and purchase this very evening from your favorite independent bookstore. Powell's, of course, would be great, but wherever you live, your favorite indie bookstore or bookshop, you need this in your body and life. I promise you, we need this book in the world so that other books like it can exist in the world. There, I did that part. But the range of the book is just, between the covers, it's vibrating. that was my lead in to the one and only Roxane Gay.
Thank you. I love the little tableau behind you. I need to make a tableau. People keep telling me I need to. Like, listen, I don't have that kind of time. Everyone has really ordered Zoom rooms, but it's just too much. But this is from my story called Reach. I'll just read the first couple pages. I enjoy tormenting my wife, Sasha. I do it because she lets me. Sasha lets me torment her because she enjoys it. We play little games, share mutual interests. She likes watching me chop onions before I fuck her over the kitchen counter so that she can taste their bite and cry without cause. I like watching her humiliate herself for me. There is a balance between us. Annie, she'll say, while we're sitting next to each other on the train on the way to work. There's always urgency in her voice, and I know what she's going to say before the words fall from her mouth. I'll turn to look at her, then look away, quietly observing the other passengers. The way the man across the aisle from us adjusts himself when he thinks no one's looking. The way the woman in the row in front of us keeps jerking her head, trying to stay awake. While I'm watching all of this, I'll turn toward my wife, my needful wife, slide my hand across my left thigh to Sasha's right, squeezing gently, slipping my fingers beneath the hem of her skirt. She'll clear her throat and look out the opposite window at the passing scenery, a light pink blush spreading across her face. She'll pretend to be somewhat disturbed, but she'll brush her thumb across my wrist and lean closer into me. We'll stare at each other in these moments, and the rest of the world recedes. All I see is my wife, her legs spreading ever wider as we pass through the unknown. Later, always, I smell her on my wedding ring. That's a little taste.
Thank you. Delightful morsel. Thank you so much.
You're welcome so much.
Well, I have no doubt that this conversation will get a little more loose and motion filled in a second. And yes, I see if you have questions, you should put them in the Q&A section. But I'm going to open with a question I have because somebody asked me to do this. And so I am attending to my desire, opening with a question that is mine. And it's a question that happens for me in each of your stories. So I hope it resonates at least a little. And it's something like, for me, there is a space or a place, a real place opened up where desire ignites. And the space plays out differently in each of your stories. There's like that line about some want being a battle between men and women in trust. Larissa, sometimes I think want is just a battle being between men and women. So there's a space opened up where there's going to be this battle. And in Sasha wants to take me somewhere, a place she has no vocabulary for, a place neither of us have been in Reach, Roxane. There's like this space of unnameable, we've never been there, etc. And then Kim, of course, there's a literal stage. Oh, that story makes me so giddy. There's a literal stage where there's a kind of, if you'll let me call it this, if this makes sense, a performance of surrender and power. Is that okay way to say it? But in that story, in your story, it's literally a stage. So there's another space. So my question is, could you each speak to that a little bit? Do you think kink allows the writer and the content to go, like an accordion opening up in ways of telling stories where you can make a space with no name, or where things are staged differently, or maybe even where sexuality does something different? What do you think about the space of kink? And here, I'll select. Larissa, you can go first, and then maybe I'll get less dictatorial about it.
No, I appreciate it. It's nice to feel a bit of direction and dare I say control in a panel, especially in the early parts. I think the way that kink functions in the story that I wrote for this anthology is a way of sort of like literalizing like certain power dynamics. And the space that opens up is sort of the difference between the things that you do want done to you and the things that you don't want done to you, and the ways in which like the younger woman, she wants certain things from this man that she's been dating for just a couple months, but she doesn't want to say them. But at the same time, she also wants things emotionally, and she also refuses to say them in a different way. So the space that opens up between those two characters can really only be bridged with sex, and they go about it in somewhat clumsy ways.
I loved that in the story. It's like want itself, like the word want, and also the feeling of want, like pinballs between them, and neither one of them can make it land, but it sort of wavers or something. That's a beautiful element to the story.
Yeah, there's a lot of refusal in it, for sure.
Kim.
Yeah, I think the question of space is really interesting, because in my story, I'm trying to play with public and private space and a performance of desire, and the role that a performance of desire can play in actual desire. And there's a lot happening in terms of perspective. I think you're encouraged to align your perspective with an audience as a reader, and then you're also encouraged to align your perspective with one of the characters in particular, and how she's playing a role on all levels. And so in both of the sense that she's playing a role in a kinky game and dynamics as one might do in private, but then she's also playing a role on stage. And she has thinking about how the presence of other people and this exhibitionist nature of what they're doing makes that role real for her, and all the things that need to be in place for that to feel real for her.
Right. Kim's story is called Scissors, for those of you asking, and Larissa's story is called Trust, for those of you asking, and Roxane's story is called Reach. All one-word titles, and they all, for me, kind of make an interstice, which is why I got giddy when I was thinking about them together. Roxane, what about like the place of kink or desire, you know, the space of it? Mike.
One of the most interesting things about kink, as a writer, as a woman, is that you can fill space. It can happen anywhere, and you can fill that space in any way that you want. It just creates an amazing container for all of your desires, all of your needs. And I think that you see that as a writer, that really appeals to me, because that makes anything possible. Like things that are so much more challenging in real life, because it requires so much time and energy and negotiation. In the story, sometimes things are just easy. Like, yes, this is the dynamic between my wife and I. This is how we get down. Yeah, I'm gonna fuck her on a train. And kink allows for that. And it does also allow for that in actual life in different ways, in that it really does create space for people to fulfill themselves or not, depending on what their particular kink is.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that. And I think about that a lot. Yeah, I think about it a lot.
Yeah, I know. One of the other things I love about both reading it and being in the reader seat, and also thinking about what the content of each story was, is that there's a certain level of freedom to play. I mean, play as this expansive notion, not just, you know, play with yourself, but like this really expansive, hot, playful space where the idea of our categories and our taboos and our restraints and our constraints, they take different form in the play space in all your stories. And then in the reader position too, it takes me to the question of reader, like, did you think about the reader position writing them or constructing them, or do you think about it now? Because I keep wondering, are the readers like hot and messy panties, or are the readers, you know, some of the stories definitely play with objection, right? I will admit I'm the hot and messy panties one, even when the story is about objection. So Who could speak to that? I see you all nodding your head. Like readers, what were you thinking? Where do you want them while they're reading this?
I actually don't think about readers too much when I write anything, because I'm writing the kinds of things that interest me. And I don't mean that in a vain way. It just means that I'm putting into the world the kinds of things that I think would be interesting and that I wish I was able to read and find. And with erotica, when I write it, actually, most people don't know this, but I have an entire other career as an erotica writer. And I just think about like what turns me on. And if it turns me on, it's going to turn someone else on. I mean, and that is where audience does start to come in, because not only do I want people to be turned on intellectually, I want them to feel something physically. And that to me is so exciting as a writer, to know that my words are going to have that kind of impact, where then you can, go and do whatever you need to do about that. That's not what it is. But we always talk about how we want to reach readers, and it's a great way to do it. But first I write for myself and what interests me, and like the sort of kinky or interesting or erotic scenarios that I come up with.
I have to say, again, in the reader seat, I find intellectual-gasm in some of the forms and play with language in all three of your stories, or the character interplay or the structure, that is as important to me as what's happening anywhere else on my body. And so I guess I just want to express gratitude for your attention, all of you, to form and structure and interplay of language. You all also touch on the use of language in all your pieces. But Kim, what can you tell us about like the reader seat and your work? Because your work actually has an audience in it on the page.
Yeah, I also wanted it to be genuinely erotic and celebratory, and for the tension in the story to come from the tension of the game they're playing, as opposed to from external conflict. And I was thinking about the reader, because to me this was a uniquely terrifying challenge that was presented. It felt very outside of my wheelhouse, and it was scarier to me to think about trying to make something sexy, like that was the intention, and doing a bad job of it. Somehow that scared me more than failing at any other element of craft or any other emotional response I might be trying to get. But then I'm also, as I think many writers are, drawn to things that frighten me and challenge me. And I was really grateful to Reese and Garth for presenting me with this task that seemed so scary, and then as a result seemed so frightening. So I was hoping that, as you put it, the reader would be on the messy panty.
I guess that's, well, or ignite the reader there. It's more formal, but it is what it is. I hear you though, too, about being called upon to write something and make it sexy is a little bit terrifying, because what if it's just dull or something, that scares me too. What about you, Larissa, in terms of reader positioning, or thinking about them or not thinking about them?
Yeah. Well, my first novella that came out a couple years ago was an erotic novella, so I've had a little bit of experience. Thank you, Kim. I've had a little experience in the messy panty realm. But the funny thing about that project, I won't divert our conversation too much, but the structure of the New Lovers novellas were that they were 6 chapters long, and each chapter had to include at least one sex scene. So sex became the thing that moved the plot along. And the way that I found that very exciting, because in each scene there was 2 or more characters interacting in a sex scene, and then the plot was driven along by the way they were relating to each other. So it had to be erotic on the one hand, but it also had to move. There had to be development. There had to be speed. So I actually wrote Trust before the anthology came into being. And when Reese and Garth reached out, I had the story ready to go, basically. It went through quite a bit of revision with them. But because I hadn't written it to be an erotic story, I guess it just turned out that it was a regular story that was already quite kinky. But it came from this desire to say something true about like relationships and about a specific kind of relationship at a specific point in one's life. So I think in this particular instance, the first question was, well, is it true? And then how can I make sure that it feels true as to the reader?
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying, and I won't drive the conversation here, but it fascinates me that there may be the possibility that language itself and storytelling itself has a kink turn that one could go down formally or in the construction of it. But I'm not gonna take us there, because then we'll just be talking about form, which is what I get off on. So whatever. But in the introduction, it says this beautifully. And this kind of speaks to the range of the stories, which I've now read the whole thing 3 times, and the range is exquisite. It says, instead of pathologizing kink, the stories treat it as a complex, psychologically rich, active communication. The stories process trauma, they process joy, they express tenderness and cruelty and affection and play. The same emotional dynamics of kink are as varied as those of any other human experience. And it's like a claim I want to stake for this book, that the human experience available in storytelling of kink is the same as any other realm of life experience, which is why I know Garth wants the book on the shelf with high literary pieces, because why not? Because this realm too is of human experience, which reminds me of what you were saying, Larissa. Is it true? Is it in our bodies? Is it in our lives? Roxane, I have to tell you this. I don't know if you guys can see the questions, but at least 3 people want to know, what is the name your erotica is published under, and how do they find it?
I'll never tell. No, let me try and remember. Oh my God, I'm so terrible. So some of it is written under, it's not at all interesting, R. Gay. I was like really
stealthy, very stealthy.
Just very stealthy. And then Delilah T. Jones. And then, oh my God, I think the other name was Luscious Jackson. My 20s were wild.
There you have it. Larissa, there's a person here named Erin who wants to know, in Trust, it's one of their favorite pieces so far. How'd you decide on that dual perspective?
That's a great question, because I have been wrestling with perspective for the last couple months, partly incited by the writing of this story, which I wrote in dual perspective without really thinking about in a formal sense. It just kind of came out that way. I realized I wanted to know what both characters were thinking. An obvious model for it is A Romantic Weekend by Mary Gateskill, which I think is written in one perspective, but the characters are, I needed to know what they were thinking. I'll be honest, I didn't really think about like what that would do formally to the story. I just knew that I wanted both of them in there.
It was interesting.
I hope that went through. I just got a notification that my internet is, yeah.
I think it went through. It had a little bit of interesting rhythm to it, but I think it went through. When I was reading it, when I got to the he perspective, first it irritated me. I'm like, I don't care what he thinks. But that was all on me. That was in my reader reaction, you know? And then it became super interesting, like I was saying before, to watch the want change definitions and change bodies. And like want was a third character in it. It was really interesting. I don't know if you guys can answer this question. I'm going to tell it to you anyway. It might be a question for the editors, but Taryn wants to know. Taryn loves this topic as it relates to feminist writers in a genre where there is so often anti-feminist and misogynist tropes and stereotypes. You with me so far? Right? What was your experience pitching these books when publishing kink erotica is so often not from these kinds of perspectives? Were publishers thrilled, curious, or skeptical? I don't know if you can talk about what publishers thought because you weren't pitching it, but you may have something to say about the question in general. There are misogynist tropes and anti-feminist tropes. Is there a way this book is counter to that? Or what relationship do these stories have to, if you know what this reader means, those other kinds of tropes? Are they a successful counter?
I mean,
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, let's hear it.
You can go ahead, Roxane. We both hit off mute at the same time.
Oh, well, I think we can both answer this. I think that there are all kinds of correctives to these misogynist tropes that we see in literature, in erotica, and books like this do open up the conversation and do allow for what I hope is a more feminist way of thinking about sex and power and the ways that people, regardless of gender, relate to one another sexually. And, you know, I think it's important to do these kinds of books and to get mainstream publishers on board with them, because a lot of times when people think of feminist erotica, I know that that's not what this book is, but people think that it's not fun or sexy, while actual feminists know it just means that no one is having anything happen to them against their will, and that women are treated as people and not merely objects. And if that is a turnoff for you, I'm not here to judge, but maybe you want to do some self-examination on that. And so I just love that this book exists and offers some ways of thinking about erotica that go beyond what we're normally exposed to. And of course, I don't know that every single story does it to the same extent, but I think every single story tries. And I think that's pretty much all you can ask for.
Heard. Kim, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. And I also think that some of the pervasiveness of those tropes, or this perception that that's what people are looking for when gets published, comes down to a lack of faith in the audience, or a misperception of who the audience for erotica is. I think there's, it assumes a very particular kind of reader who that's all they want, right? That they want the same things they've always seen. They want the same the same prescripted events to happen in the same way, and people to be treated in the way that they've always seen. I also think there's a lot of value in reading about sexuality beyond just the things you know that you personally find erotically interesting, which is not something that I think you do a lot of the time, right? And I think there's so much value in seeing this greater scope of humanity and sexual interest, which is one of the things that kink offers, right? I think there isn't a reader who's going to find absolutely everything in the book exactly to their taste, but there's so much more to be found there because of it.
That's a good little bridge to another area of questioning, which not every story in the book is even about erotica or hotness or sex or exchanges in sexuality. Some of the stories in the book have or kind of stage the possibility that transgressive or kink or BDSM experiences could provide healing spaces, or could provide intellectual consciousness raising spaces. This has been true in my personal life, and so those stories are interesting to me. It's not all about the sexy time. It's also a realm of self-discovery and consciousness and possible healing for some people. Garth has spoken eloquently on this topic. Anybody want to take a run at that idea? I found myself identifying with some of those stories because it's been true in my life.
I'm still personally. Oh.
Go ahead, Larissa.
Larissa,
thank
go
you.
ahead, then Roxane.
Okay. I'm still parsing quite the framing that I want to use when talking about this sort of concept, but in another interview for this anthology, I mentioned that I see kink as almost like a description of surfaces or like the textures of things, and I think like because it so literalizes like a lot of dynamics that are already present in our lives, or it takes emotions and exchanges that already happen and then kind of blows them up as setups. It allows so much more clarity to emerge around those things, which I think it just makes you pay closer attention, and it magnifies things that are already there. So it makes a lot of sense that stories in an anthology about kink would deal with those kinds of exchanges and those kinds of dynamics without necessarily being about sex at all. Like I don't think sex needs to be part of kink. There's sex in my story, but there's some. I mean, we could also talk about the definition. Okay, I don't want to go there because now we're going to talk about the definition of sex, and that's too far. But
No, I hear you. We hear you. We get what you're saying. And I'm the one trying to open it up to might be sex, might not be sex, might be a whole range of other. But what else, Roxane?
Oh, I would just say, I was just going to say, I write about this a lot. Well, not a lot. I write about this though, reasonably. That's one of the things that is most exciting about kink, is that place of healing. And, for me, that framework of consent is so great to know that you can negotiate what's going to happen. And there are always going to be surprises that are awesome or not. But there's a way to stop what you don't like and to continue what you do. And I don't think it gets enough credit for that. And again, it's not your medicine, it's not homework. It's just this when it's done right, this very healthy framework for allowing yourself to do things that are risky and to do things that scare you, but have a safety net. And there's something actually really erotic about that, because if you have this framework, you can actually try anything. And I think it allows people who are willing to take those risks to get into the kinds of things that would ordinarily be seen as taboo and as dangerous, but they're only dangerous if you don't have a safety net and if you aren't well informed and following the very broad rules of kink. And when I was coming up in the community, it was like safe, sane, and consensual, which I think is still around. And it's just so simple. And frankly, I think it should apply to every kind of sexual encounter and beyond. I certainly have applied it to any kind of sexual encounter in my life, whether the person I was having good times with was kinky or not, because it's a really reasonable framework. I could talk about this for hours, but that's all I'll say about that.
Love it, love it. Kim, I want to go back to you for a second. I'm so mesmerized by the performance element in your story, and it made me think many different things. But one of the things it made me think was that aren't we always in a performance role when we're having any kind of exchange around desire? So that's one thing I thought while I was reading it. And then I thought this story heightens that idea and also allows an audience in. and I thought, well, is there any time, so it's like performance turned on high versus the idea that maybe is it always performance? I mean, all of your stories, I think you could argue all of your stories, the people in them, the characters in them play roles. Would you agree with that? Humans? Okay, I got a little bit ahead on. But Kim, is your story like, yeah, but what if we turn the dial on high and explored the politics of performance and power exchange and audience?
I think that speaks to what Roxane just said, actually, about applying the rules and dynamic of kink more broadly, in the same way that you're talking about, of thinking of is it always a performance, and is there a way sex is always a performance, and how much safer it is when you come into it without assumptions that anything doesn't need to be discussed. I think you could say to anyone in a non-sexual context, like, so whether they're kinky or not, imagine if you knew for sure that you would be safe no matter what, and that you wouldn't be taken anywhere you didn't want to go. If you had that knowledge in hand, think of all the grand adventures you could have. Think of all the extremes of human experience that could be yours if you knew that. And I think that bedrock of trust and consent is the ideal of kink for me. And I think it may be more useful to have an ideal of kink than to have a definition exactly, to say that this is what we're working towards, because we live in an imperfect world and we're all imperfect actors, and literature isn't necessarily concerned with utopian perfection, right? But I think all the stories in the collection are conscious of that ideal and are conscious of people struggling towards it.
I agree with you, all of them. I'm thinking like they're all rattling through my brain in a giant file right now, like this one does it this way, this one does it that way. And they're all in some relationship between surrender or control. And both positions to reach their fullest free space would need the agreement that what would you do if you knew you'd be safe? Even the control position enters a freer expanse. If there's agreement upon what would you do if you could be completely safe. Christy wants to know if kink is an area where the false categories from book marketing, okay, first think about the false categories of book marketing, which I could talk for hours about, are particularly unfortunate because it sets up the idea that readers who want strong stories that are literary or genre can't also want scenes that include kink. Does kink, erotica, and those of us who want to read it in all the work we read suffer more from these constructed market categories, I think is what she's trying to ask. I mean, is it particularly, constrained because it's kink, market-wise, industry-wise?
I don't know. I think that pretty much everything, kink is not something that it's still considered taboo. It's certainly those barriers have softened since, and I hate to admit this, but since 50 Shades of Grey,
Yeah,
which is not actually kink, but
no.
whatever. It at least opened the conversation and got more people thinking about it and talking about it. And fortunately, a great many writers stepped up to the plate to correct many of the myths that 50 Shades of Grey sets forth, and frankly, some of the abusive behavior. But, publishing categories are very rigid. And that's because marketers have very rigid ideas about how books are going to sell and if books are going to sell. And they always believe that their conventional wisdom is the only wisdom. And that's why, we'll see books in obscure places in bookstores instead of, at those beautiful tables at the front. I don't know how it will change. I think that sex is something that publishing, they love it when it really works in their favor, but they're very narrow about what they'll allow themselves to love. The reason that 50 Shades of Grey did so well is because it's extraordinarily heteronormative. And it's about two white, wealthy, thin, conventionally attractive people. And you won't see a book like that about anyone who deviates from that. And that's a real problem. And, I think that's the kind of thinking in publishing that underlies a lot of these rigid categories. And that's actually where a lot of our attention should go, more than the categories, which are arbitrary and whatever. Books are going to sell despite those categories.
I hear you. I hear you.
It's a question about what will actually get published to even be categorized in the first place. And I think that's where a lot of our attention should be, because it's so rigid for anyone who strays from what they want and what they expect.
Agree. I have two thoughts on that to just add alongside what you're saying. And one is that if you are in one of those stores where the heteronormative and safe books are glossy and in front, you should absolutely go to the back aisles and have sex on the floor in those actual stores, because that's one way we can resist and persist and, you know, mess their aisles up a little bit. And then another thing is, in some ways, it feels like I could make the argument that true kink, not 50 Shades of Grey, but what I think of as authentic kink is kind of a decolonization of heteronormative desire. The bodies are different and can be anything. The activities can be anything. The constraints are taken back and made into literal, Larissa, to follow up on some things you're saying, made into literal elements in this story, like real constraints instead of the constraints that come from market or capitalism, theoretically. So, you know, you could get all up in the idea that if we had more books like this one, like Kink, we would be writing resistance or revolutionary stories up against what the market has deemed sexually legitimized. And I would be on board for that in a million ways. Kelly has this really cool question, Larissa, that I'm going to try and push your way, because I thought about it when I was reading your story, or something like this question. How does consent intersect with consciousness? But then she also asked right after that, how does kink intersect with intimacy? And there's such an interesting dynamic going on in your story, particularly with the woman character, where she wants more than one thing, and those things kind of crash into each other sometimes. And intimacy is a question in that story. Like, if she's super vulnerable and intimacy happens, is that good or bad? Is kind of a question in the story. But so I'm gonna say it again. How does consent intersect with consciousness, or how does kink intersect with intimacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I also unmuted just because I wanted to follow up on something you were saying about this like radical potential of kink. And I think that's it's related to why I love reading a story and realizing that it's kinky when it's not marketed to me in that way in any sense. Partly because I think kink can come to encompass basically everything. Like, I don't know, if you're in a certain frame of mind, like you're reading like a Regency romance and, you know, like there's like the heroine and a little sliver of skin is showing between her glove and her sleeve in that moment is so erotic. I don't know, that's kinky to me. Like, so I think it can be everywhere, and I'm excited about the possibility of that. Regarding this question, yeah, well, I have a lot of thoughts about consent that are maybe a bit wide ranging for this conversation, but I do think that one of the most complicated things about consent is I think figuring out what you want in order to ask for it. Um, I think that as a whole, I'm going to say some really broad sweeping statements about American sexual culture, but I would say on the whole, young people are not generally always equipped to be able to openly say what they want from a partner. Making that request can be feel very dire, especially in a sexual sense, and especially almost even more so in an emotional sense. And because that territory can intersect in like, you know, like a romantic relationship where you're also sexually involved with each other, that becomes a very fraught area. And the way I think kink plays into this is that in a kink setting, you can be in a situation where you're engaging in very intimate acts with another person who you don't know at all and who you don't want anything from except for, you know, say you're, you know, trussed up on a St. Andrew's or, you know, one of those big crosses, and someone's flogging you and you just tell them like, oh, I want it here and not here, and they'll listen to you because that's the contract that you've gone into. And then, you know, you put on your little coat and you go into the night, and both of you have gotten what you wanted. So I don't know if this like really answers the question, but I think that kink can be an avenue towards intimacy, but I also think in a really freeing and remarkable way, it doesn't have to be intimate at all, and it can be a kind of exchange or a way of understanding but it doesn't require you necessarily to lay yourself bare unless you want to.
Love it, love it. I prefer questions that just ripple out in conversation to answers. So you made me happy. Also, the idea that kink can happen anywhere. Some of the most erotic moments of my life came from places people wouldn't even imagine. I'm thinking of one right now in the movie The Handmaiden. One woman is in a bath and the other woman is filing a sharp part of her tooth down. I almost died. I literally fell on the floor just from like that 10-second image moment of that scene, not even where you think it should be, but just that moment, I'm like, oh, she's filing her tooth, and I fell down on the floor. I almost died. Francis wants to know, in Roxane, in your story, the specific language of each player's bodies and anatomy. Surely readers will notice the play in that scenario. Perhaps because I have been reading Andrea Lawler's Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl, I'm primed as a reader for genderqueer shapeshifting. Or is this story more playfully manipulating the labels for sex toys, body parts, and tools? I believe they're referencing the places in the story where there's a cock and a clit on the same body, and I'm sure some readers go, what? And other readers go, oh yeah.
Yes. I would say it's both. It's definitely about blurring the lines of gender. It's a butch femme relationship. And, you know, it's been surprising. A surprising number of people have been like, thank you for writing an intersex character, which I wasn't doing. But if that resonates in that way, I don't think it's a bad thing. It truly is a cisgender woman who is fucking her wife with a cock. And, you know, we rarely see any, in lesbian erotica in particular, like, I don't see a lot of focus on like the mechanics of it, that yes, you have this cock, and when it's positioned right, it interacts with your clit. These are things that happen. And I also thought it would be interesting and fun to blur the lines of gender, because a lot of lesbian sex is about gender fuckery.
Yeah.
And I think that's incredibly erotic. And I love playing in that space as a writer, because it confuses the reader, but hopefully in a productive way rather than a frustrating way where the reader is just like, oh my God, this is too much. And hopefully it's also just sexy. And so that's what I was going for.
Love it, love it. This might, you know, I'm watching the time, even though what I secretly really want to do is have a slumber party. So I'll just cop to that right now. But there's this question from Serenity, which is, what attracted each of you to writing in this anthology with kink as a central theme? Here's the book cover again to help move the book. You need this in your life. We need more books like this in literary landscape. What made you want to be in it? Do it. I blew the deadline, so I screwed myself. So what made you want to be in it? Larissa.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say I'll go first. I just had a story that I couldn't figure out what home to give it. And then, you know, the email from Reese and Garth showed up in my inbox, and I was like, well, they'll understand. And they did. So it was pretty easy for me. And then also they sort of convinced me with the list of everyone else that they had talked to, and that was very exciting to be in such company.
Kim?
Yeah, I mean, I already talked about how it seems so challenging to me and so outside of my wheelhouse. I think that insofar as my fiction had ever dealt with sexuality, I'd been really focused on it as like a site of trauma and a site of conflict. In that way where it's like, if I was writing bad sex, you could unpack it for pages, but if it was good sex, then you get like one lyrical phrase and you move on. And I felt like this was an opportunity to sort of re-examine that, and then also, Reese and Garth, their stated goals for the anthology, were very moving to me and were things I agreed with politically. And I was also excited by the list of writers that came along with that email.
Oh, it's a hot lineup. More messy panties for sure. And Roxane, I know your history of writing, so I am not in the dark about that. But I mean, what particularly about this project?
I actually wasn't going to do it because I knew I wasn't going to have the energy or the ability to come up with a new story. And then I think they came back to me and I said, well, I could use an older story. And they said, yes, that would be okay. And so I took an older story and it was the lineup. And I had actually, I think in a galley, had just read Garth's Gospodor.
Yeah.
From Cleanness.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, holy, and I've also read Reese's fiction, and I've read an erotic story of hers, and I think, and after the Incendiaries, she's a brilliant writer. And so I suspected that she was going to have impeccable taste in terms of the stories she pulled together. But I had just read Gospodor, and I just remember thinking, oh my God, he's writing about kink in a really frank way that we don't often see. People tend to be very florid and very avoidant when writing about sex, erotica, kink in fiction and literary fiction in particular. And so I just knew, okay, my story will be in good hands. And of course, I will also third the lineup, which is full of really incredible writers that I'm very honored to be alongside.
Somebody's asking, will there be a kink too? Hell yeah, there'll be a kink too. Hello, Simon and Schuster.
I suspect there'll be a kink too because kink 1 is doing very well.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Well, we've come to that kind of awkward space where we're wrapping up, but we want to thank you all for being here. I would love to know more about, like, I wish there was a part 2 where I say this. Okay, now we're taking the elevator down a level. Okay, let's go. And ask you some questions that make you squirm. But I guess I have to do that privately, unless you want to meet me later. Kim has returned to make sure Lidia doesn't make a mess or a problem.
I'm not concerned about that. So we'll have to schedule part 2 with the elevator going down a level when the new book comes out. I really want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. And it was really a pleasure to welcome all 4 of you. For the audience members, please consider purchasing a copy of Kink by visiting us at pals.com. And be sure to check out our lineup of upcoming events while you're there. We look forward to seeing you at another one very soon. Roxane, Larissa, Kim, Lidia, thank you all again. We're very grateful to you. And have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.